Thank you all for being here. This is the second of 6 webinars, a part of our national webinar series. I'm going to introduce our first speaker here, Chase Guindon, coordinator of the PEI Invasive Species Council. And PEI ISC is a nonprofit organization, and they're dedicated to preventing the introduction and spread of invasive species across PEI. And although Chase is now based in Charlottetown, he was born and raised in Southern Ontario, where he spent several years working for the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters on their invading species awareness programs. And, as an island, PEI is isolated from the natural spread of invasive species by the Northumberland Strait. And for the next 20 or 30 minutes or so, Chase will discuss his work with the council and, their approach to early detection of invasive species on the island, as they move along the Atlantic coast. Highlight monitoring programs for species like emerald ash borer, hemlock, woolly adelgid, things like that. And at this point, I'm going to stop sharing. And Chase, I'm going to pass things off to you.
Thank you. So hey everyone, as Chris said, my name is Chase Guindon. I coordinate the Prince Edward Island Invasive Species Council. And today I'm going to present on a highly acronymed title of EAB and HWA EDRR on PEI. So that just means emerald ash borer and hemlock woolly adelgid early detection and rapid response on Prince Edward Island, of course. So the Prince Edward Island Invasive Species Council, like Chris said, we're a nonprofit organization here on PEI dedicated to preventing the spread and establishment of invasive species on the island. And we generally do this through outreach and education, surveying and monitoring, and lots of on-the-ground management throughout the year. We're also a chapter of the Canadian Council on Invasive Species, the operating chapter for Prince Edward Island, and the only invasive species organization on PEI. But lots of our partner organizations and nonprofits across PEI are also putting in a lot of time and dedication to managing invasive species. Some of them are on the screen here. These are the organizations that make up our council and direct our work, provide expertise, and in a lot of cases, actual on-the-ground support and sort of that person power to get stuff done on the ground. Up until January, our full-time staff were only 2 people, including myself and our technician, Clay. We now have 3 employees, with our newest employee focusing on aquatic invasive species. So we didn't have the capacity or funding to do any aquatic stuff before. We were fully terrestrial, but just this year we're starting to get our feet wet, so to speak. Our work really wouldn't be possible without the dedication from all the other nonprofits and partners of ours across Prince Edward Island. So these are just the partner organizations that we worked with last year. We worked with about 30 or more partners to actually accomplish everything that we were able to accomplish. So just always want to acknowledge all these people and organizations that make our work possible. Our funding comes from the province of Prince Edward Island itself, as well as the Environment and Climate Change Canada Forested Landscape Priority Place for Species at Risk funding stream. Especially as far as terrestrial invasive species go, that's generally where the money to do that work comes from. We also get a little bit of money for sort of species-specific projects in the summertime through the Wildlife Conservation Fund, which is money that comes from people buying conservation license plates. So Prince Edward Island, Chris mentioned, we are a little bit unique from an invasive species perspective in that we are isolated from the natural spread of most invasives coming from the mainland provinces and states. And that's thanks to just this geographical feature called the Northumberland Strait. And it essentially acts as a 15 or so kilometer wide moat around our island, preventing the natural spread of species like emerald ash borer, hemlock woolly adelgid that I'm going to be talking about today, and especially plants that cannot move on their own at all. So most of our focus and most of the potential for spread really comes from human movement. So of course, any moat needs to, or any moat needs to have a drawbridge. Prince Edward Island has 3 of them. So that is the Confederation Bridge from New Brunswick. It is the ferry from Wood Islands, PEI, and it's also the ferry from Surrey to the Magdalene Islands. We don't worry so much about the ferry to the Magdalenes, but the forest pests that we're worried about, namely emerald ash borer and hemlock woolly adelgid, are both present on the mainland. So we really are trying to focus our efforts on preventing these 2 particular species from making it across our sort of theoretical drawbridges to the island. So this really means, oh, actually, I guess one more thing I just quickly wanted to mention about PEI is that most of our land is privately owned. So that can add some challenges to invasive species work, especially with actual access to land. So on PEI, over 80% of the land on the island is privately owned. In comparison to Canada as a whole, I think about 90% of our country's land is crown land. So sort of the opposite situation that we have here on PEI. The 2 species that we're most worried about right now are the emerald ash borer and hemlock woolly adelgid. Emerald ash borer, of course, affects species of true ash trees. We have white ash, green ash, and black ash on PEI, which would all be threatened by emerald ash borer. Our black ash is a species at risk here on the island, and also the one that is most affected by EAB. Hemlock, and so that's present in New Brunswick. Hemlock woolly adelgid is currently present in Nova Scotia, just on the other side of the ferry. It, of course, attacks hemlock trees on PEI. That would be our eastern hemlock. It wouldn't be a proper invasive species webinar without showing the invasion curve. So this is basically a graph that we use a lot in our work, just to sort of visualize over time how an area can grow in its infestation size, and the costs also rise at the same time there. So for both of these species, because they are not present on PEI, and we're just sort of at the edge of their eastern range in Canada, we're still at this prevention step here. And when you're in the prevention step, really you want to be focusing your efforts on early detection, as well as outreach and education. So if emerald ash borer was to make it to Prince Edward Island, it would most likely be as a result of the movement of firewood. It cannot fly across the Northumberland Strait, so it would need some help actually getting over here. With hemlock woolly adelgid, there's a few other considerations, especially the movement of migratory birds, which could transport the adelgids over, and maybe not so much firewood. But we put a lot of effort into this buy local, burn local campaign, which I saw Chris had on his slide earlier as well. This is essentially asking people not to move firewood from, in our case, from the mainland, and especially not from areas that have established populations of emerald ash borer and hemlock woolly adelgid. So beyond just the sort of public education and outreach portion with the Buy Local, Burn Local campaign, we also have these firewood disposal bins set up at the 2 main entry points to the island. So we have one of these set up at the Confederation Bridge and one of these set up at the ferry in Wood Islands. And the idea is that if people do bring over firewood from the mainland, they can deposit it in this box and receive a free bundle of locally produced firewood in exchange. So on the firewood bins, we have these little signs. The person depositing the wood can scan the QR code and it will pull up a coupon for a free bundle of firewood on their phone. They can take that coupon to any of our participating provincial parks or our national park, PEI National Park, and get their local firewood. So that's just sort of one of the initiatives that we're trying to put forward to prevent that spread of off-island firewood to PEI. We also have these signs up in some key areas. So again, there's this sign at the bridge, sign at the ferry. There's one of these signs in Cavendish, which is our big tourist area here on Prince Edward Island. And there's another sign in Surrey as well. So just trying to get the word out. I couldn't find a range map for emerald ash borer, but this is pretty close. This is a map of regulated areas for the emerald ash borer. And if you're not familiar with these regulated areas, they are a really good tool in preventing the spread. And it essentially prohibits the movement of particular high-risk sort of materials from a regulated area where emerald ash borer would be present to an unregulated area. So, for example, it would be unlawful to move firewood from anywhere in this part of New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Quebec, and Ontario into Prince Edward Island. It also applies to sort of commercial movement of wood and wood products, which would have to be specially certified by the CFIA before coming into the unregulated areas here. For our early detection efforts, this is the main thing that we do. So this is a prism trap for emerald ash borer. If you're not familiar with these traps, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse or not. I've kind of been sort of circling things. But it is a three-sided corrugated plastic trap in this bright green color. The outside is covered with a sticky coating. And then on the inside, we hang a little bag and a little rubber piece with some pheromones on them. So in the bag, there is a liquid that's scented like a damaged plant. And then in the little rubber piece that's inside the trap there, it's scented like a lady or female emerald ash borer. The idea is that if emerald ash borer was present in the area, it would be attracted to the trap. It would run straight into the side and get stuck to it. We go out sort of early in the field season and put these as high up as we can in ash trees with this big long pole. It's called a Mr. Long Arm there with a hook on the end. And then we check them a couple times throughout the season. We bring them down and have a look at what is stuck to it. So we got 10 of these up across the province. The city of Charlottetown puts them up on their own, and then the CFIA puts them up as well. So there's quite a few of these traps across the island. Generally, when we take them down, this is what we find, a whole lot of bycatch. Depending on where you are, it could be flies, could be other little insects. And then sometimes you'll find a suspect Agrillis species, which I've tried to zoom in here on the right. That was one of our native Agrillis species, but it sure looked like a emerald ash borer. So that's really our best tool for early detection. If we did detect, or if we did find emerald ash borer on one of these traps, we would implement our response strategy, which would involve multiple partners across the island in trying to first sort of delimitate the extent of the population, and then hopefully treating some valuable trees. We also look for reports from the public. So we put out stuff on social media and at presentations on how people can notice the signs and symptoms of an emerald ash borer invasion and provide them with tools to report that to us. If we receive a report that is suspect, we go and check it out ourselves. We also are building a map of true ash species on Prince Edward Island. Using as many sort of different sources of data as we can, including iNaturalist, reports from the public, data from the province, and data from our partners. And this would really be, for one, to help us pick trapping sites for the emerald ash borer, and also to help us in the event that emerald ash borer is detected. We need to know where the ash trees are. Moving on to Hemlock woolly adelgid. So this isn't present in New Brunswick, but it is present very heavily in southwestern Nova Scotia. Generally in this area here, it is starting to move closer to Halifax. I actually think there's been some detections in the Halifax region that maybe aren't identified on this map here. And then there is also a eDNA detection in Truro, Nova Scotia, but no actual specimens found. And I'll talk about what eDNA means in this case in just a second. So obviously getting pretty or getting too close for comfort here for us on PEI. We don't have a whole lot of hemlock trees, definitely not hemlock dominated forests the way that Nova Scotia does, but we still want to protect them. They're a very important ecological species and cultural species here. So this isn't a picture from Nova Scotia. This is a picture from the Appalachian Mountains, but just showing what kind of devastation the Hemlock woolly adelgid can do. I imagine there are some landscapes in Nova Scotia that probably look pretty similar to this, unfortunately, with how much hemlock exists over there. So a couple things we're doing to try and detect the presence of Hemlock woolly adelgid as soon as possible when it arrives, to allow us to respond as soon as possible when it arrives. The main method we used just starting this past summer was setting up these eDNA traps. So this was a project in partnership with the Invasive Species Center based out of Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. And they print out these 3D, or they 3D print these plastic plates with 4 areas that will house microscope slides. The microscope slides are covered in Vaseline. We put them on a little stake, 1.5 meters out of the ground underneath hemlock, ideally in sort of an area with more than just one hemlock. And they sit out there all summer long. We collect them in the fall, and then we send it all back to the lab to be analyzed. And the idea here is that even if a microscopic little piece of Hemlock woolly adelgid dandruff or body parts or anything like that we wouldn't be able to actually see with our own naked eyes would be able to be detected in a lab. So we had 15 of these kits go out this summer, and it really is a community science-based approach. So landowners would essentially receive this kit here. They would provide a stake themselves, go out to their hemlock that they have on their property, set up the plate in the eDNA trap under the hemlock. At the end of the season, collect it, package it up, give it to us, and then we ship it to Ontario to be analyzed. So when they go to the lab, they go through a visual analysis. That's Teresa from the Invasive Species Center, checking them out there. And then they're shipped to a CFIA for actual eDNA analysis as well. And I'm happy to report this year there was no Hemlock woolly adelgid eDNA detected on any of our traps. So that was a really fun project, really cool. It's the first project of its kind for Prince Edward Island. A couple other ways that we try and sample for Hemlock woolly adelgid is using these Velcro covered racquetballs that we launch up into the canopies of hemlock trees, with the idea here that if there was some Hemlock woolly adelgid way up high in the canopy, which is typically where you would find it, not necessarily down low where you can reach it with your arms, that the woolly coating on the insects would get attached to the Velcro, and then we'd be able to see it when the ball comes down. So this is a big slingshot made for launching tennis balls for dogs that we just got from Cabela's, and then a bunch of racket balls that we open up and fill with beads to sort of weigh them down, and then we glue the Velcro to the outside. So go out there and just launch racket balls through trees for a few days, which is a whole lot of fun. We also make these kits available to the local watershed groups, landowners, woodlot owners, any sort of community organization that wants to do some Hemlock woolly adelgid monitoring on their properties. Just quickly, we also tested out interception traps this year just by using some repurposed emerald ash borer traps on a stake, sort of in a triangle underneath a hemlock tree, and that would be used for sort of a visual detection of hemlock woolly adelgid if it was to fall and get stuck on the trap. They're really, really tiny, so we did have to use a microscope to actually analyze those if there's something suspect. But again, no hemlock woolly adelgid was detected. And just like for emerald ash borer in the ash map, we're building a hemlock map for PEI. Something like this did not exist for our island before, and having this data is really important for the actual response following the detection of hemlock woolly adelgid. Again, community outreach is really important, getting people to know about this stuff. We hosted a special event at our local independent cinema downtown at City Cinema in Charlottetown here, where we screened the documentary In the Quiet in the Dark, which is all about Donna Crossland and her fight against the spread of hemlock woolly adelgid in Nova Scotia. That movie's available for free on CBC Gem. It's really, really good, really inspiring, sort of devastating at the same time. I recommend everybody go out and check that out if you're interested in this sort of stuff. And that's it. Hopefully I'm on time. Again, thank you to our funders, Environment and Climate Change Canada, as well as the province of Prince Edward Island for making this work possible. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Chase. Great presentation. And I'm in New Brunswick, which is just next door, but we don't have HWA yet, but we do have EAB. So I hope you guys continue to be negative for EAB because it's very bad. We'll go on to some questions. I love the ball surveying. We did that. I've done that with some youth groups here in New Brunswick. Took them out to try that out. They really love doing that. And on that note, I was wondering, or sorry, there's a question in chat from Megan, and how youth can get involved with invasive species work on PEI.
Yeah, I think really the best way, Megan, for youth to get involved, for me, what comes to mind is reporting invasive species, learning how to identify them. So we get all of our reports generally through iNaturalist, and we really want people to be using that application to sort of log what kind of species are around in either in their backyard, parks by their house, at their school, things like that, to help us better understand the distribution of, well, organisms on PEI in general, but in our case, the distribution of invasive species. So if there's youth that have a smartphone, which I imagine most do, they can download the iNaturalist app and start snapping pictures of firstly invasive species that they recognize, maybe wild cucumber, Japanese knotweed, things like that, and upload those observations to iNaturalist. And it's also a really great tool for learning how to ID things. So if there's something on there that, maybe looks like it could be invasive or is behaving in that sort of a way, it can help there. That would be the first thing that comes to mind, but feel free to reach out to us. I don't know if you're a youth yourself or somebody who organizes stuff for youth, but please reach out and we can chat more about that.
Awesome. Yeah, I wonder if they are wondering if you accept volunteers, if there's any volunteer opportunities with PI, Invasive Species Council.
They're pretty few and far between. With most of our management stuff, it sort of gets risky with actual invasive plant management, but I think it would completely depend on the person's age and sort of their experience. So again, if you're interested in volunteer opportunities, reach out. We do have a little list of people to email when those things come up.
Awesome. Cool. We have another question in chat. Ken, good to see you here. Let's see. Do you have information on where hemlock ash trees are in PEI? I know you showed that map of hemlock trees. Is that
Yeah.
how'd you produce that map? Is that through public? They
So
self-report their trees?
yeah, so for that map, we used the provincial LiDAR data. We always scrape that data from iNaturalist. So for invasive species as well as true ash species and hemlock species. So we add those to the map. And then we also encourage landowners to either put their species on iNaturalist or send us locations. So we got a lot of data that way, especially from woodlot owners on PEI who we work with. And so that's generally what we do. And I think maybe Ken asked that question before I was showing those maps, so that probably answered it. And then yes, definitely getting out information about doing tree checks whenever we can access those groups of people.
Awesome. Sweet. I had a quick question. Let's see. You said it's unlawful to move firewood from an unregistered area to, sorry, from a regulated area to an unregulated area like PEI.
Mhm.
Is that enforced in any way?
I mean, probably not to the extent we might hope. I'm not really sure how the enforcement of that works. I know like there's definitely not somebody at the bridge and at the ferry checking for firewood or papers from just people moving across. I imagine though, in the case of commercial materials, it would be enforced if the vehicle or the transport truck is stopping at a weigh station. But I think, like I said, it's a good tool, but I think a lot will slip through the cracks. One, just based on public knowledge of those regulated areas. I don't know how well people are familiar with those. Um, and two, just I mean, people might still just move firewood, even if they're aware of the regulated areas, because you're not going to get caught, sort of a thing.
So yeah, that makes sense. It'd be really hard to regulate that.
Yeah, yeah. We'd have to set up the COVID tents again at
Yeah.
the bridge and check everybody's trunk, which I don't think the province will go for that.
Let's do one more and then call it. Let's see. We have one final question. Is there community-based surveillance of EAB in your area? I'm from Edmonton and would like to learn how to launch these kinds of citizen science activities.
Yeah, so community-based surveillance of EAB really is just checking for the signs of it. So those D-shaped exit holes, the S-shaped galleries under the tree, or just the general poor health of ash trees. And what we really ask in those cases is for people to send us photos either on Facebook or by email. And then we go from there. People send us photos of unhealthy trees all the time. Most of the time, it's not something that would be caused by emerald ash borer, for example. But in the case that there was, like if somebody sent me a picture of a D-shaped exit hole on a tree, I'd be out there same day. So I don't know if iNaturalist is necessarily a tool for that sort of thing because you're more reporting potential signs and symptoms, but maybe it could be. I think any opportunity to use iNaturalist for community-based science is a great one. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but just getting the information out there about the signs and symptoms and having a distinct place for people to be able to report those things to somebody who can look at them and assess them from there. It's really important.
Mhm. And Edmonton in Alberta, there's the Alberta Invasive Species Council that does the same sort of work.
Of course.
Sweet. Chase, thanks so much. That's time. Thanks so much for taking the time to present with us here. And we'll move on to our next presenter. Awesome. Sweet. I'm excited to present our second speaker, Chris Herc. Chris Herc, originally from New Brunswick, and has lived and worked across Canada before settling into his role as environmental manager with Ground Council Treaty Number 3. And through his work at the Ground Council, Chris works with the 28 Treaty 3 communities on long-term water quality monitoring, community-based climate impacts monitoring, invasive species management, and species at risk conservation to build and strengthen capacity for Indigenous-led stewardship and protection of the lands, waters, and relations in Treaty 3. From Mandate to Monitoring, Mapping and Management Council, Treaty Number 3, Chris's presentation for the next 20 or so minutes will highlight challenges and solutions for invasive species management in the often forgotten about areas of Canada. So with that, I will stop sharing. And Chris, the floor is yours here.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for having me, everyone, and thanks for the invite from CCIS. Yeah, my name's Chris. I've been working at the Grand Council Treaty 3 for about 8 years now. Grand Council Treaty 3 and Treaty 3, many people out there might be unfamiliar with who Grand Council is and, where Treaty 3 is. But Grand Council Treaty 3 is the traditional form of government for the 28 Treaty 3 communities. And then within Grand Council, there's a lot of different departments dealing, with health, social, economic, many other ones. But the department I'm in is the Territorial Planning Unit, which essentially deals with all things environmental. And we're guided by Manitou, Aki, and Okanagan, which translates to the Great Earth Law. So we do have a lot of environmental work coming out of the Territorial Planning Unit, whether it's policy related, emergency management related, compliance and enforcement related, or more on the ground in fields, which is kind of where the stewardship subunit, which I help lead, comes into. So we work with Treaty 3 communities just to really kind of talk about what environmental concerns they have. A lot of our work is based around water quality and community-based water quality monitoring. But over the years, we've expanded to include a lot of other things, which invasive species is one of them, which we're going to talk a little bit more about today. So just to kind of give a little bit more context on where Treaty 3 is, it's in very northwestern Ontario, also extends a little bit into southeastern Manitoba, and is right above Minnesota. So from an invasive species perspective, we have access to southern Ontario, through Highway 1 going east into Thunder Bay down south, or, if you're coming up, going northwest. Manitoba as well, and Minnesota, and Treaty 3's right in the middle there and is a very popular tourist destination for those that like boating and just being out there on the land. So unfortunately, we do have a lot of pathways into Treaty 3 that invasive species can take. So when I first started, it was back in 2018. It was mostly just focused on, setting up a community-based water quality monitoring program with Treaty 3 communities. But through a lot of the engagement work that we did, we started to hear that invasive species was a concern for many and, wanting to know what invasive species were out there. So that has started up over the years and expanded to include zebra mussel monitoring, purple loosestrife monitoring and biocontrol projects, creating a Treaty 3 aquatic invasive species information book, boat decontamination stations, and starting up management working group for Phragmites, which is a ton of work. But, I did say, or Chris kind of introduced it as, invasive species work in often forgotten areas and setting a mandate. When I first started with the Territorial Planning Unit at Grand Council, the TPU is largely just, here to work with communities for environmental policy, a little bit of compliance work, engagement, and consultation, but no real on the ground environmental field work happening or monitoring work. So we did start with water, but pretty quickly, like I said, through community engagement, found out that many communities were concerned about invasive species, with a lot of questions about what invasive species are actually in Treaty 3. I find one thing, in kind of a more remote area is you often hear about many different invasive species, but Treaty 3, for example, any information books that we do get shared to us are for all of Ontario, and oftentimes we don't know which ones are actually here in Treaty 3. So a lot of community members wondering what invasive species are there, how it's infecting, the lands and waters, and what Grand Council Treaty 3 itself is doing. And so, after hearing these questions, doing some background research, there's not a lot of invasive species work happening in Treaty 3. We don't have a conservation authority there in Kenora or anywhere else in Treaty 3 territory. Very few environmental NGOs, doing work in Treaty 3, whether they're large scale ones that, reach across Canada or just, very local minor ones, not a lot of them. And coupled with, those that are doing actual invasive species work, it's, maybe one or two on top of what Treaty 3 is doing now. And also, looking towards government, whether it's on a federal, provincial, or municipal scale, very minor work being led, for the scope and size of Treaty 3, given that it's 55,000 square miles. So taking all that into account, we worked with Grand Council's Treaty 3 leadership, which is chiefs from communities, lands and resources technicians, just to set, a scope of work and what we can accomplish, given the capacity that we have. So discussing what species of concern are in Treaty 3, which ones communities would like to be focused on from their perspective, but also, what can we actually reasonably pull in resources to work on as well. Project feasibility. Again, the size of Treaty 3 is 55,000 square miles, which, I do compare that to the size of New Brunswick since I grew up there. It's about twice the size of New Brunswick. So just to give you some context, when I say project feasibility, it's myself and one dedicated full-time staff member and some summer students doing invasive species work across Treaty 3. And how can we have communities involved in that invasive species work as well? So zebra mussels was one of the most species of concern from a community perspective. If you're familiar with zebra mussels, one thing they do need is calcium, a lot of it in the water to really, flourish and become a huge threat. Given the geology and Treaty 3 and Lake of the Woods and all the other water systems we have here, calcium can be quite low on the concentration scale. And by quite low, I mean, probably anywhere between 6 to 12 milligrams per liters on average, I'd say. But, there are pocket areas where it's, around 20 milligrams or plus, 20 milligrams per liter of calcium, which is what they need to thrive. So it could be an issue depending where you're at in Treaty 3. So we did start very small with zebra mussels. We were able to pull in just a very small amount of funding through the Invasive Species Center to create zebra mussel settlement samplers, which we, got out to communities so communities could have reliable things to pull out of the water to check just to see if zebra mussels were growing there, adult ones. We had reached out to MNRF just to see what kind of zebra mussel monitoring they were doing in the area, as we heard they were leading work. So around Kenora, they're leading sample collections about twice a year, and very specific area in southern Lake of the Woods as well. But again, given the size of Treaty 3 and the fact that there's thousands of water bodies here, not all Treaty 3 communities are represented and not all areas across Treaty 3 being monitored. So we're able to slowly pull in more funding to lead zebra mussel veliger sampling, which veligers are the baby versions of zebra mussels. So collecting water samples using very fine mesh nets to send that away for lab testing for presence. So where are we getting to in Treaty 3? I just have a map here of our 2024 monitoring area. So we got out to 90 or 57 unique sites across Treaty 3, 90 samples total. So we have more samples than unique sites, just given that, we do have a lot of large water bodies. So wanted, as best as we can, adequately sample around for better coverage. So a lot of sites on Lake of the Woods and Rainy Lake. This year, we did have 0 samples that tested positive for veliger presence, which we're happy about. Last year, 2023, though, was our first year of doing it. We got it to 73 unique sites, so a little bit more unique sites, but less samples total. And we did find 3 samples that were positive for veliger presence. So over in very kind of northwestern section of Treaty 3, in Saugeen First Nation on Lake Winnipeg. We did have a couple confirmed presence there, which was unsurprising, just given that Lake Winnipeg does have a lot of zebra mussels and beligers in it. But first to Treaty 3 and on the Canada side, in Rainy Lake, we did have a positive presence detection in northwestern Rainy Lake, which is the first on the Canadian side. So we do have a U.S., Rainy Lake extends into the United States. So the Department of Natural Resources, I think, in Minnesota, whatever they're called, has done some testing and found zebra mussel beligers on their side as well. Just one thing I want to note about, potential cross-contamination questions that maybe you're having. We did do the Rainy Lake sampling site before the Saugeen site, so there was no potential for cross-contamination there. All right, a lot more I can say on zebra mussels, but limited time. So if anyone has questions, happy to answer them or expand on anything. But Phragmites is a species that we are focusing on as well. Not a lot of community members familiar with Phragmites, but given its prevalence and impacts that it can have in Canada and has been having in Canada, especially in Southern Ontario and elsewhere, is a species that we started doing some early detection monitoring for. One thing that we've noted, over the past couple of years we've been doing this, is Phragmites grows a little bit differently up here compared to Southern Ontario and elsewhere. If you're familiar with invasive frag, there's also a native variety. And so the native variety typically grows a little bit shorter, maybe 3 meters, around there. But invasive Phragmites can grow up to 4 to 5 meters. What we have been finding, though, is that invasive Phragmites that we've been able to confirm up here, grows short as well, only around 3 meters, 3.5 meters on average. So kind of one of the biggest physical indicators of it is the robust seed heads and the darker coloration to them. So those pictures on the left-hand side, that's some confirmed invasive Phragmites, and that species, or that Phragmites on the right that I'm holding there, is not invasive. It was confirmed native variety. And so you can see, it's quite tall, but, so height isn't a big physical indicator here, but, the seed head size and the color is one of the main ones we go with. And so when I talk about confirmed presence of invasive Phragmites versus native Phragmites, we do some DNA testing across Treaty 3 where, as we're driving around on some of the major roadways and side highways and side roads, we do look to see what we think is invasive based on site, and then collect a leaf sample to send away for DNA testing to a lab. So in 2023, we got out and mapped 91 different Phragmites growing stands in Treaty 3. That means we physically or visually thought, 91 of these could have been invasive, based on height and seed head, and, DNA sampled 61 of them upon further inspection. And then from there, when we got the results back, 17 were confirmed invasive. So you can kind of see, just based on our mapping here, Fort Frances down in Southern Treaty 3, we have an international border crossing, at International Falls into the Minnesota side. So you can see there's a small cluster of red circles there, and we had, I think, 7 invasive stands down there. So, that's a big crossover area for Phragmites entering into Treaty 3. And you can see coming west from Thunder Bay along Highway 1, Trans-Canada Highway, that highway acting as a vector as well into Treaty 3 with just some sporadic growing areas of invasive frag. Notably, even though Phragmites has been found in Manitoba in 2023, nothing along the sections that we were monitoring on Highway 1, west of Kenora, all came up native. But we do have our 2024 results in as well. You can see we mapped 1,130 stands. That was mostly through just GPS tagging by car, but we're still visually keying out species to stop for and sample. So we did stop for an additional 77 this year, and 12 of those came up. So 12 more new invasive confirmed. So again, around Fort Frances, we got to some of the more side highways. or side by side highway, I mean side dirt roads or residential roads. So more down there than we initially got in 2023. More additional ones along Highway 1 around the Dryden area, coming west in from Thunder Bay. Notably in 2024, we do actually have Phragmites creeping in along Highway 1 from Manitoba. So with two of those right on the very western border edge. I just want to quickly speak to purple loosestrife work that we've been doing. So as we've been driving around for Phragmites mapping, we also use iNaturalist just to log purple loosestrife that we see in the fields, making note of any areas that we deem problematic. Again, we only have so much capacity, so any invasive species is problematic, but when given our lack of capacity and what we have time to focus on and funding to focus on, what we consider problematic for this is areas of purple loosestrife that aren't a couple plants growing, but actually a couple thousand. So we do have one section like that we've identified in 2023 after mapping out 81 growing areas along the roads. In 2024, we were able to have a pilot biocontrol project, releasing some purple loosestrife beetles that will consume those. So I was able to do some follow-up monitoring last year on that throughout the season, but going to do more follow-up monitoring on it this season just to see the rate at which it's being reduced through that biocontrol project. And that was kind of our first, foray into the management side of things, that purple loosestrife biocontrol project. We did get some funding to lead some Phragmites management working groups. So bringing in municipal government, the small amount of NGOs that we do have operating in Treaty 3 together, just to discuss, what we do with Phragmites. We're able to find it through Grand Council Treaty 3. So the next logical step here is, how do we take this information where it's growing and what's the process to manage it and to remove it, and so whose authority and whose jurisdiction is it to lead that management. So looking like it's probably going to be Grand Council Treaty 3 leading it. We have been in contact with MTO, so they're able to potentially help remove some highway growing locations, but when we're getting into more residential areas, likely going to have to be Treaty 3, possibly working in conjunction with Treaty 3 communities and municipalities for that. Just through DFO, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, they had an Aquatic Invasive Species Action Fund or Prevention Fund that we were successfully able to apply for. So that's been helping fund some of our zebra mussel monitoring work, but also funding some boat decontamination stations that we are going to be putting in across Treaty 3. We got our first one at the tail end of last fall. That's going to be in the Kenora area this year. You can see we translated everything on it to Anishinaabe Moan as well. And excited to have that work officially start this open water season, and going to expand to have more in the Dryden and Fort Francis area as well. Kind of just mentioning back to one thing I said very early on was, we get a lot of information books sent our way, but none of them are Treaty 3 specific. So a little bit of funding to create our own aquatic invasive species guidebook specific to Treaty 3, and going to have it be dual language in Anishinaabe Moan and English. And we're just putting the final touches on the draft copy, which CCIS has been very helpful in giving us some comments and things to consider in the creation of that guidebook. That was a lot. If anyone has questions, I'm not sure what time I'm at, but I probably do know we're approaching 1 o'clock your time or 12 o'clock my time. So happy to answer anything or expand on anything that I might have glossed over quickly there.
Well, hey, Chris, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with us here. That was an awesome presentation. We have about 5 minutes for questions. So if anyone has questions, please put them in the chat. Chris, we've chatted before. We had that meeting before, and I didn't realize during that meeting this size of Grand Council Treaty 3. So a lot of work goes into what you do. And when working with such a large area like that spans across, borders, provincial borders, things like that, does dealing with different agencies, regulations across those borders pose challenges to monitoring and taking immediate action? Are there also any positives with working with so many different partners?
Yeah, I mean, definitely some of the challenges there. we really don't with Minnesota, being a kind of a vector pathway there, like we don't have a lot of pull or say on anything happening there. And, if anything were to happen, it would, likely have to go through DFO on a federal scale. So really can't do much there. Uh, for zebra mussel specifically, one of the challenges has been is Manitoba has very strict monitoring protocols and permit systems, whereas Ontario is nothing for the most part. So yeah, just navigating all the different protocols and processes across different jurisdictional boundaries is kind of one of our big hurdles. Yeah, but on the other, side of things, a lot of different potential, groups to work with and a lot of different perspectives and capacity that, can help out in what we're doing and how we can help out in what they're doing. Just for example, Voyageur National Park in Minnesota, wasn't really aware that Phragmites was growing that far north in Minnesota. And so it might not be on their side of things, but, the fact that it's growing on the Fort Francis international border, when they saw kind of our results come out, they reached out to us just to talk about what our monitoring protocols were and how they could potentially set something up there. So, that's a national park scale on the United States border, reaching out to Little Hold Grand Council Treaty 3 and its 3 invasive species staff asking for some insight there. So yeah, a lot of different ways it's been, we can work together and it's interesting to see.
Awesome. That's very cool. Let's see. We have one question in chat here. You touched on this, but maybe could you go back over characteristics of native Phragmites, maybe how you'd ID it visually, or do you kind of need to go to that DNA testing?
Yeah, so there's some other ones in there. Maybe I'll screen share my screen just to bring it up again. But yeah, I mean, depending where you're at, height could be an indicator. Where's our Phragmites? So when I talked about, the seed head being larger, more robust, we have three invasive seed heads there. Two are, robust and dark purple. Those were clipped off of that year's plant. And then we still had in a bag, an example of the seed head from an invasive from the previous year. So you can still, that's the beige colored one. So it just lost all its color, but still retained its shape. So this invasive variety or the native variety is a lot smaller. So that tiny, beige one from the previous year is an example. But just skipping over, you can see the picture on the right. It's a tall plant, very thin, sparse seed head. Still might have, some color to it beyond beige. One thing that, you're going to see on some invasive versus native comparisons here is where are we at? The leaf on the native, and this is a very unreliable one, I'd say, is a yellowish green color. Whereas, the invasive is a blue green color. So again, like on the right hand side, we have that yellowish green color versus that blue green. It can be difficult to ID in the field, so I wouldn't call that a reliable one. One that's been fairly reliable to us is the red-brown color on the stem. So it's always on kind of like the bottom third, maybe halfway up. There'll be red on the native variety, maybe dark brownish colored, but it's always been there. And on the invasive variety, it's usually just kind of a beige, darker, or a green color. So no red coloring or brown coloring at all. And that one's been pretty reliable to us. If you want to get into, hand microscope stuff in the field, you can be measuring ligules on the leaves, which is apparently quite reliable, but we don't, opt to do that one in the field just because it's a lot of, more time intensive. And again, one of our biggest, struggles is, staff capacity and time that we have to put across everything we're doing here.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, definitely challenge that they look a lot more similar up north there. Let's see. I have one more question, and then we'll call it there. But you mentioned there was a few positive mussel veliger detections across Treaty 3. Has there been any follow-up on those positives, or are you just kind of keeping an eye on those bodies now?
No real follow-up. We did more increased monitoring on Rainy Lake uh, this year. So kind of in 2023, a lot more follow-up monitoring on Rainy Lake from us, but nothing found. So another area that has found a zebra mussel veliger in the past was Shoal Lake. Shoal Lake provides its water to Winnipeg, and just through Manitoba like lead monitoring, not Grand Council Treaty 3. There's been, I think that was back in 2018 or 2019 when they found it. So over the last like 5 or 6 years, they've been doing a lot of monitoring there yearly and haven't found any since. So kind of in both cases, you're kind of left wondering of like how did the zebra mussel veliger get here? Did it just happen to fall off a boat? We got the only single one in our net. Seems unlikely, but at the same time, when the calcium concentrations are low in the water, it's also unlikely that a zebra mussel population is going to establish. So the best you can do is just to follow up monitoring. And if you're not, readily finding veligers, year to year, it's, not deemed an issue out this way.